Marcus Whitmore adjusted his silk tie as he gazed out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse overlooking Central Park. At 72, he had accumulated a fortune worth $800 million through ruthless business dealings and an uncanny ability to exploit others' weaknesses. His mansion staff of 12 had learned to move like ghosts through the marble halls, speaking only when spoken to, invisible fixtures in his world of opulence. Elena Vasquez had been cleaning his study for 3 years, dusting the same mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound books he never read, polishing the same crystal decanters filled with whiskey older than most people. She was 45, a quiet woman from Guatemala whose calloused hands told stories of a life spent serving others. Her broken English and humble demeanor made Marcus barely notice her existence, which was exactly how he preferred his help to be. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Elena entered the study at precisely 9 o'clock, her cleaning cart squeaking softly across the Persian rug. Marcus sat behind his enormous desk, reviewing financial reports that would determine the fates of thousands of employees across his various companies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Elena worked methodically, her movements practiced and efficient. She had learned to read Marcus's moods over the years, knew when his jaw tightened before he fired someone over the phone, recognized the particular way he drummed his fingers when plotting a hostile takeover. Today, however, something was different. There was an excitement in his eyes, a predatory gleam that made her nervous. "Elena," he called suddenly, causing her to jump. She rarely heard her name from his lips. Usually he simply snapped his fingers when he needed something. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, setting down her feather duster and turning to face him. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "How long have you worked for me?" 3 years, sir." 3 years of cleaning, cooking, serving. Tell me, what do you know about languages?" Elena shifted uncomfortably. She had always been self-conscious about her accent, the way English words sometimes tangled on her tongue despite years of practice. "I speak Spanish, sir. Little bit of English." Modest. Marcus's smile widened. "I've heard you on the phone with your daughter. Your English is better than you pretend." He stood and walked to a massive safe hidden behind a painting of some long-dead ancestor. After entering a complex combination, he withdrew a small, yellowed piece of paper. "This," he said, holding up the document, "belonged to my grandfather. He was quite the character, spent years traveling through South America in the early 1900s, mining, trading, making enemies and fortunes in equal measure." Elena watched as Marcus approached her, the paper held delicately between his manicured fingers. She could see strange markings on it, symbols that looked vaguely familiar, yet completely foreign. "Before he died, my grandfather told me this paper contained the location of a treasure worth more than everything I've built. But there was a catch." Marcus's eyes glittered with amusement. "It's written in some indigenous language he picked up during his travels. He claimed only someone with pure intentions could translate it properly." Elena stared at the paper, her heart beginning to race. The symbols seemed to shift and move in the morning light, forming patterns that tugged at something deep in her memory. "I've shown this to linguistics professors, historians, even paid fortune tellers." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "All failures. But looking at you now, I'm wondering if I've been asking the wrong people." He held the paper closer to Elena's face. "So here's my proposition, little maid. Translate this for me, and I'll give you something beyond your wildest dreams. I'll transfer my entire fortune to you. $800 million. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the paper. The moment her fingers touched the aged parchment, memories flooded back with overwhelming force. Her grandmother's voice, speaking in the ancient tongue of their ancestors, the Kaqchikel Maya. Stories told by candlelight about the old ways, the sacred knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who worked in silence, enduring, surviving, protecting. The symbols on the paper weren't random markings at all. They were words, warnings, a message that made Elena's blood run cold as understanding dawned. Marcus watched her intently, noting how her expression changed from confusion to recognition to something he couldn't quite identify. "Well, can you read it?" Quote. Elena looked up at him, this man who had treated her as furniture for 3 years, who paid her barely enough to support her daughter's college education, who had never once asked about her life, her dreams, her struggles. Something shifted in her posture, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her chin. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can read it." "Excellent." Marcus clapped his hands together. "What does it say? Where is the treasure?" Elena studied the paper again, reading the flowing script that her grandmother had taught her in secret, a language that colonizers had tried to erase, but that survived in whispers and lullabies. The message was simple, beautiful, and devastating. "It says," Elena began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "the greatest treasure is not gold or silver, but the love of family, the respect of community, and the peace that comes from honest work. He who seeks to take from others what he has not earned will find only emptiness. True wealth belongs to those who give, not those who hoard." Marcus's smile faltered. That's not possible. It must say something about a location, coordinates, something useful." "There is more," Elena continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "It says, 'Beware the man who treats workers as slaves, for his greed will be his downfall.' The indigenous people of this land see his black heart. The treasure he seeks is already in the hands of those he despises." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus snatched the paper back, staring at it as if it might reveal different words through sheer force of will. "You're lying. That can't be what it says." Elena smiled for the first time in 3 years of working in this house. "Your grandfather was not the man you think he was, Mr. Whitmore." "What do you mean?" "He came to our village when my great-grandmother was young, but he did not come as a conqueror or a thief. He came as a refugee, running from men who wanted to kill him for stealing from his business partners." Elena's voice carried the weight of generations of oral history. "Our people took him in, fed him, protected him. In return, he learned our ways, our language. He fell in love with our values." Marcus's face was growing pale, but Elena wasn't finished. "He wrote that message himself in our language as a test. He wanted to make sure his descendants understood what true wealth means before they could inherit his real treasure." "What real treasure?" Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. Elena reached into her worn apron and pulled out a small leather pouch that she had carried every day for 20 years, a family heirloom passed down from her great-grandmother. Inside was a tarnished silver locket containing a photograph of a young man with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Your grandfather never left Guatemala, Mr. Whitmore. He married my great-grandmother, took our name, lived among us until he died. Everything he had, he gave to our family, to our community. The money that built schools, the wells that brought clean water, the medical clinic that saved my daughter's life when she was born." Marcus stared at the photograph, recognition dawning in his eyes. The face in the locket looked exactly like the portrait that hung in his study, the ancestor he had never known but whose legacy he had claimed. "That makes you—" Marcus stumbled over the words. "Your cousin," Elena finished quietly. "And this house, this fortune you're so proud of, it was built on money stolen from the people your grandfather came to love. Money he spent his whole life trying to give back." Elena set the paper gently on Marcus's desk and picked up her feather duster. "The true treasure, the one your grandfather wanted his family to find, was not gold. It was understanding. Compassion. The knowledge that we are all connected, that wealth means nothing if it comes from the suffering of others." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at the man who had just discovered that his entire identity was built on a lie. "I will not take your money, Mr. Whitmore, but I will tell you what your grandfather would want you to know. It is not too late to choose a different path. The people you have hurt, the communities your businesses have destroyed, they can be helped. You have the power to honor your grandfather's real legacy." Marcus collapsed into his chair, the weight of revelation crushing down on him. For the first time in decades, he was seeing clearly. The empire he had built, the ruthless tactics he had used, the way he had treated people like Elena, it was everything his grandfather had run away from. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't felt since childhood. Elena smiled again, and this time it was filled with warmth and hope. "Listen to your heart, cousin. It knows the way home." Quote. As she left the study, Marcus sat alone with the yellowed paper and the photograph of the grandfather he had never understood. Outside, Central Park stretched green and alive, full of families enjoying picnics, children playing, people living simple, honest lives. For the first time, it looked more beautiful than any balance sheet he had ever seen. The maid, who was not just a maid, had given him the greatest treasure of all, the chance to become the man his grandfather had died hoping he would be. Whether he would take that chance remained to be seen, but for the first time in his life, Marcus Whitmore understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. The next morning, Elena arrived at the penthouse expecting to find Marcus in his usual position behind the massive desk, barking orders into his phone while the stock market opened. Instead, she found him sitting on the floor of his study, surrounded by photo albums, letters, and documents she had never seen before. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from sleeping in his chair. "I found them," he said without looking up when he heard her footsteps, "hidden in my grandfather's things. Letters he wrote, but never sent, photographs from Guatemala, records of every dollar he gave away." Elena set down her cleaning supplies and approached cautiously. Scattered across the Persian rug were dozens of black and white photographs showing a man who looked remarkably like Marcus, but whose eyes held warmth instead of calculation. In one picture, he was teaching children to read under a tree. In another, he was working alongside villagers to build what looked like a well. "His real name was Miguel," Marcus continued, his voice hoarse from crying. "Miguel Vasquez. He took your great-grandmother's name when they married." Elena knelt beside him and picked up one of the letters. Even though it was written in English, she could see her great-grandmother's influence in the gentle tone, the way he wrote about community and family, as if they were sacred things. "He wrote this one just before he died," Marcus said, handing her a letter with shaking hands. "It's addressed to his American family, explaining why he never came home, why he chose to stay." Elena read aloud in her careful English, "I came to this place running from the man I had become, a man who valued gold more than souls. The people here showed me what I had lost, what I had thrown away in my pursuit of wealth. I cannot return to that life. I have children here now, a wife who sees good in me that I never knew existed. My American family will inherit my businesses, but they will not inherit my heart. That belongs here, with people who taught me that the richest man is not the one who has the most, but the one who gives the most." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I spent 72 years becoming everything he ran away from." Elena reached out and touched his shoulder, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. "But you are not him. You can choose differently." "How?" Marcus looked at her with the desperation of a drowning man. "How do I undo decades of damage? How do I face the thousands of people I've hurt?" Elena thought of her daughter Maria, studying pre-med at Columbia University on a partial scholarship, working 2 jobs to pay for what the scholarship didn't cover. She thought of her neighbors in Queens, families struggling to pay rent while working multiple jobs. She thought of the communities in Guatemala where her cousins still lived, where clean water was still a luxury, and education was still a dream for many children. "You start small," she said, "like your grandfather did, one person, one family, one community at a time." Marcus struggled to his feet, his body feeling every one of his 72 years. "Will you help me? I don't know how to do this alone." Elena hesitated. Helping Marcus meant stepping out of the shadows where she had lived safely for years. It meant risking her job, her security, everything she had worked so hard to build for herself and her daughter. But looking at this broken man who had just discovered he was family, she saw something of her great-grandmother's stories. The belief that redemption was always possible for those who truly sought it. "I will help," she said finally, "but not as your maid, as your partner." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Marcus's first instinct was to write enormous checks, to throw money at problems the way he always had. But Elena taught him patience, showed him that real change required relationship, trust, time. Together they started small. They began with Marcus's own employees. Instead of the sterile corporate announcements he usually sent, Marcus began meeting with workers personally, listening to their struggles, their fears, their dreams. He learned that Sandra from accounting was caring for her disabled mother. He discovered that James from the mailroom was sleeping in his car because he couldn't afford both rent and his daughter's medical bills. Elena watched as Marcus struggled with each story, seeing his own callousness reflected in the faces of people he had ignored for years. She saw him change, slowly but surely, From a man who saw employees as numbers on a spreadsheet to someone who understood that every decision he made affected real families, real lives. The changes started rippling outward. Marcus began restructuring his companies, not to maximize profit, but to maximize human dignity. He raised minimum wages across all his businesses, implemented comprehensive health care, created childcare centers and educational opportunities. Some of his board members resigned in protest, calling him weak, crazy, a bleeding heart who had lost his edge. Marcus found he didn't care what they thought anymore. Elena's role evolved from cleaning woman to trusted advisor. She helped Marcus understand not just what needed to be done, but how to do it with respect and humility. When they traveled to Guatemala to visit the communities his grandfather had loved, Elena served as translator not just of language, but of culture, helping Marcus navigate the complex relationships between past and present, privilege and responsibility. In the village where their grandfather had lived and died, they found a statue erected in his honor, not as Miguel Whitmore, the American businessman, but as Miguel Vasquez, the teacher, the healer, the man who had shown them that outsiders could become family if they came with open hearts. The village elder, Elena's great-uncle Carlos, embraced Marcus with tears in his eyes. "You have his face," he said in Spanish, which Elena translated. "But more importantly, you have found his heart." They spent 2 weeks in Guatemala, and Marcus experienced wealth of a different kind. Children who had nothing but torn clothes and bright smiles competed to show him the schools and clinics his grandfather had built. Families invited him to share meals of beans and tortillas that tasted better than any five-star restaurant he had ever visited. He slept on a straw mattress in Carlos's modest home and woke each morning feeling more rested than he had in years. On their last night, Elena found Marcus sitting alone under the same tree where his grandfather had taught children to read. The village was quiet, except for the sounds of night birds and distant laughter from a neighboring house where someone was celebrating a birthday. "I understand now," Marcus said as Elena sat beside him. "This feeling, this peace, I've been chasing it my whole life without knowing what it was." "What will you do when we return?" Elena asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. "I want to give it away. All of it. The money, the properties, everything. I want to create something that will outlast me, something that honors both versions of our grandfather." Elena smiled. "That is a big dream. The biggest. But I've learned something from you, from this place. Big dreams are achieved through small steps, taken with people you trust." When they returned to New York, Marcus began the most ambitious project of his life. Working with Elena, he established the Miguel Vasquez Foundation, dedicated to education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for underserved communities. But this wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was investment in human potential, structured to give people the tools they needed to build their own prosperity. Elena became the foundation's director, a role that required her to learn new skills, to speak at conferences, to manage budgets larger than she had ever imagined. Marcus watched with pride as she grew into her power, as she learned to command respect in rooms full of wealthy philanthropists and community leaders. The most challenging part was facing the people Marcus had hurt over the years. Some refused to see him, their anger too deep for forgiveness. Others listened skeptically as he attempted to make amends, offering not just money, but genuine accountability for the damage he had caused. Maria, Elena's daughter, was one of the harshest critics initially. "How do we know this isn't just another business strategy?" she demanded during a family dinner at Elena's apartment in Queens, the first time Marcus had ever seen where his cousin actually lived. The tiny apartment, with its hand-sewn curtains and photographs of family members spanning generations, humbled Marcus more than any boardroom ever had. Here was real wealth, measured in love, sacrifice, and dreams passed from mother to daughter. "You don't know," Marcus answered honestly. "All you have is my word, and I understand that my word hasn't meant much in the past. All I can do is prove it through my actions every day for as long as I have left." Maria studied him with eyes that reminded Marcus of Elena's fierce intelligence. "My mother believes in you. That means something. But if you hurt her, if you use her trust for your own benefit, you'll answer to me." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I would expect nothing less." As months turned into years, the foundation grew beyond anything Marcus had originally envisioned. Schools in Guatemala, community centers in the Bronx, job training programs in Detroit, clean water initiatives in rural communities across 3 countries. But the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers or the press coverage. It was in the letters that arrived daily, stories of lives changed, opportunities created, hope restored. There was Rosa, a single mother in Los Angeles, who used a foundation microloan to start a catering business that now employed 12 people. There was David, a former gang member in Chicago who became a teacher through the foundation's education program and was now working to keep other kids off the streets. There was an entire village in Honduras where foundation-funded solar panels had brought electricity for the first time, allowing children to study after dark and adults to start small businesses. Each story reminded Marcus of his grandfather's letters, of the man who had chosen love over greed, community over isolation. He began to understand that Miguel Vasquez hadn't abandoned his American family. He had been trying to show them a better way to live. On Marcus's 75th birthday, Elena organized a surprise party at the foundation's headquarters. The guest list included people from every level of society, former employees he had helped, community leaders from the neighborhoods where the foundation worked, his cousins from Guatemala, and even some of his former business rivals who had grudgingly come to respect his transformation. As Marcus looked around the room, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people who cared about him not because of his wealth or power, but because of who he had chosen to become. The richest man in the room was Elena, who had given up the safety of invisibility to help him find his way home to himself. In his brief speech that evening, Marcus held up the same yellowed paper that had started it all. 3 years ago, I thought this document would lead me to treasure. I was right, but not in the way I expected. The real treasure wasn't hidden in some distant place. It was here all along, in the people I was too blind to see, in the connections I was too afraid to make. He looked directly at Elena, his cousin, his teacher, his friend. Someone very wise once told me that the greatest treasure is the love of family, the respect of community, and the peace that comes from honest work. Tonight, I am the richest man alive. As the party continued around them, Elena and Marcus stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the city lights. 3 years ago, she had been invisible to him, just another person whose life he affected without thought or care. Now she was his closest advisor, the person who had saved him from himself. "Do you think he would be proud?" Marcus asked, meaning their grandfather. Elena smiled, thinking of all the stories her great-grandmother had told her, all the dreams that had been passed down through generations of women who cleaned other people's houses while building better futures for their children. "Yes," she said softly, "I think he would be very proud indeed." In the distance, the lights of the city twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a family, a dream. And, for the first time in his 75 years, Marcus Whitmore understood that true wealth wasn't about having more than others, but about making sure that others had enough. The Maid's translation had indeed left him speechless, but more importantly, it had taught him how to speak a new language entirely, the language of love, compassion, and genuine human connection. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when Elena first translated the paper that changed everything. Marcus was now 77, moving slower but with a lightness in his step that seemed to defy his age. His hair had gone completely white, and his face bore the lines of someone who had learned to smile genuinely after decades of practiced expressions. The foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, but more importantly, it had grown roots. Communities that had received help were now helping others, creating a network of support that stretched across continents. The model they had created, focusing on empowerment rather than dependency, had been adopted by organizations worldwide. Elena, now 50, had blossomed into a confident leader whose opinion was sought by politicians, academics, and social activists. Her daughter Maria had graduated medical school and was doing her residency at a hospital in Guatemala, providing health care to the same communities where her great-great-grandfather had once lived. The cycle of giving back continued, stronger with each generation. On this particular morning, Elena found Marcus in his study, but not behind the imposing desk. Instead, he was sitting in a comfortable chair by the window, reading letters from foundation beneficiaries. His morning ritual had changed from reviewing stock prices to reading stories of hope and transformation. "The children from the school in Quetzaltenango sent drawings," he said, holding up colorful pictures made with crayon and love. Look at this one, Elena. It's supposed to be us, visiting their village. Elena laughed at the stick figure drawing that showed two people holding hands with dozens of smiling children around them. You have very long legs in this picture. And you have a crown, Marcus pointed out. Smart kids. Elena settled into the chair beside him, a routine they had developed over the years. These quiet moments before the day began had become precious to both of them, a time to reflect on how far they had traveled from that morning when she was just a maid and he was just a cruel man with too much money. I have news, Elena said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and sadness. Marcus looked up from the letters, noting the tone. Good news or difficult news? Both. Elena took a deep breath. Maria called last night. She's been offered a position with Doctors Without Borders. They want to send her to refugee camps in Central America. Marcus felt pride and worry war in his chest. In the years since their first trip to Guatemala, Maria had become like a granddaughter to him, the family he had never had. That's wonderful. And terrifying. She said something that reminded me of your grandfather's letters. She said she finally understands the difference between having a career and having a calling. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up below them. Central Park was green with summer, filled with joggers and dog walkers and families starting their days. It was the same view Marcus had looked at for decades, but everything about how he saw it had changed. There's something else, Elena continued. The doctors want to do more tests. Marcus's attention sharpened immediately. Elena had been experiencing fatigue and dizziness for weeks, but she had dismissed it as the result of their busy travel schedule and the stress of managing the foundation's rapid growth. What kind of tests? Heart problems, they think, possibly serious ones. Elena's voice was calm, but Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. I didn't want to worry you until I knew more. Marcus reached over and took her hand, these hands that had cleaned his house for years while harboring the wisdom that would save his soul. We'll face whatever it is together, the best doctors, the best treatment, whatever you need. Elena smiled. I know you would move mountains for me now, but that's not what I'm worried about. What then? Elena looked at this man who had once treated her as invisible furniture, who now asked about her concerns with genuine care in his voice. In those two simple words, she heard everything that had changed between them. The Marcus of 5 years ago would never have asked that question, would never have cared about the fears of a maid. I'm worried, she said softly, that I never thanked you. Thanked me? Marcus was confused. For what? For letting me translate that paper. For trusting me with your grandfather's secret. For giving me the chance to help you find your way home. Elena's eyes filled with tears. You think I saved you, but you saved me too. You gave me a voice, a purpose, a family I never knew I had. Marcus reached over and took her weathered hands in his. We saved each other. Elena nodded, understanding finally that this was the real treasure their grandfather had hidden in his cryptic message, not gold or land or money, but the simple miracle of two people from different worlds, choosing to see each other as family, choosing to build something beautiful together. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows, illuminating the same room where their story had begun, but everything was different now. The man who had once demanded translations was now fluent in the language of compassion. The woman who had once cleaned in silence was now a leader whose voice was heard around the world. And in that simple question, what then lay the promise of all their tomorrows, all the problems they would solve together, all the lives they would touch, all the love they would share? The maid's translation had indeed left him speechless, but it had also taught them both how to speak the most important language of all, the language of the heart. Their grandfather would have been proud,